Welcome, aquatic science students, to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center. We wish you could be here in person with us today. It's a pretty nice day out, and our ponds and our lake are pretty full because of all the rain we've got recently. But since you can't be here, we're going to do our best to make you feel like you're here on a virtual field trip with us this morning. If you are watching this and have not registered for this field trip yet, you can still do that by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC register to get yourself or your class registered for this field trip. We just use that information for our attendance purposes. And today's virtual field trip is called Interdependence and Interactions in Aquatic Environments. During this virtual field trip, students will identify the interdependence of organisms in the aquatic environment and the biosphere. Students will identify how energy flows and matter cycles through the aquatic environment. Students will also explore the factors affecting aquatic population cycles. So we're going to start off this morning's field trip by exploring producers, consumers, and decomposers with Mr. Monroe. Next, we're going to explore interdependence of organisms with Mrs. Fuller. Third, we're going to explore how energy flows and matter cycles with Mr. Mirez. And last, we're going to explore aquatic population cycles with Ms. Nash. While we're doing all of that, you can ask us questions, and we encourage you to ask questions. Since this is a virtual field trip, the way you do that is you go to www.tiny.cc/EEC-question-answer. And once you get there, you'll fill out a super short form to ask us any questions you have related to aquatic science. You can ask as many questions as you like, and we will do our best to answer all of them in the time that we have with you this morning. So let me stop sharing my screen here and turn it over to Mr. Monroe, who will get us started with producers, consumers, and decomposers.
Good morning, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and my part of your virtual field trip today is that we're going to explore producers, consumers, and decomposers. There's a very special interaction, or a very special relationship that each of those components that make up what we call the biotic side of that particular ecosystem that we're referring to as an aquatic ecosystem. And those interactions are very important to each one of those components. There's an old word that probably is not mentioned very much, and that is the science word niche. Producers, consumers, and decomposers are major niches or roles or jobs that organisms that fall into those categories play. I'm going to start out by talking about producers. You heard Mr. Broughton mention that we now have an abundance of water in our ponds, and we're very thankful for that. And we know there's a lot of aquatic organisms that fall into those roles that are now existing out there. I'm going to start out by talking about producers. There's another name that we give producers. We call those autotrophs. They have the ability to manufacture or make their own food within their own structure. Of course, you guys by this time should know we're talking about plants. Now, in our ponds, our aquatic systems out here, we don't have a lot of aquatic plants, and I'll mention that a little later on in my part of this virtual field trip. Probably the most or the primary producer that we have in our ponds right now, or our aquatic system out here, and it's very limited right now simply because of the type of weather conditions that we have, but it is something called green algae. Looks pretty nasty. Because it's green, it goes through the process that land plants go through called photosynthesis to make its own food. And in that process, that algae is producing oxygen that is used by the aquatic organisms that live in our ponds and our lake, okay? So green algae is our primary producer. Kind of nasty looking, but it's very important. It is also a food source. It plays the same role as producers play on land, okay? Now, as far as consumers are organisms that cannot manufacture their own food within their own structure. They have to eat something else. It's part of this major energy flow that exists between producers, consumers, and decomposers. Now, I have a variety of consumers that I want to show you. I'm going to start out by showing you probably the most common, if I can catch one of these little guys, the most common fish that we find in our ponds. This little guy is called a green sunfish. Basically, if you were here with us today, we would be doing what they call sampling. I would probably have you guys in the pond or the lake in chest waders, and we would use a collecting net to collect whatever organisms that we can find. But this is an example of a green sunfish. Now, this little fish can be a prey, meaning that other fish would probably eat him, or he can also be a predator. He would probably eat a smaller fish or a small aquatic insect. So he is an example of a consumer. I have another consumer that primarily he would fall into the category of being an omnivore. This is the most common aquatic turtle that we have in this region. This little guy is a red ear slider. He's not so little because they don't get very large anyhow, but I would estimate that this turtle right here is probably somewhere around maybe 10 years old. As you can see, if he would stick his head out a little further, I don't want to stick my finger up there too far because he might bite me, but he has red marks in a location on his head where ears of most animals are located, and that's how he gets his name. Believe it or not, the type of consumer that this red ear slider is, he is an omnivore. When I first started working out here, the population of these guys kept other aquatic plants from being prevalent or common around here, simply because they love to eat the roots from some aquatic plants. They also love to eat fish. So they fall into the category of being an omnivore. This is the most common, again, this is the most common aquatic turtle that we have in this region. And this does happen to be a male if you are questioning that. He has very special adaptations that allow him to really move about that water very well. He has webbed feet. All right, the next fellow that I'm going to introduce to you the type of consumer that Hoppy is, this is Hoppy the American bullfrog, the type of consumer that he loves to eat bugs and insects. So he is an insectivore. He has adaptations that allow him to be an excellent bug catcher. He has a very sticky tongue that can extend out quite a ways. And if you look at his eyes, he's got pretty good peripheral vision. He has the adaptation of having webbed feet, so that allows him to swim and move about the aquatic system very well. But this is Hoppy the bullfrog. He's an insectivore. Boy, there's so many different types of consumers, right? Okay, now, whether you're aware of it or not, there are different levels of consumers. I have a consumer that's in the next bucket down here that I'm going to get out. And you know, we have primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. I've often asked students, what do they think a tertiary consumer would be in a pond or in a lake? And I come up with a variety of answers. Probably the most common is an alligator. But we don't have alligators out here. We do have a consumer like Snappy. Let me get Snappy out. This is Snappy the snapping turtle. And of course, Snappy is a tertiary consumer. That means this guy is a carnivore. He's smiling at you. Check that out. But he is a carnivore. And he has several adaptations that allow him to really survive in the environment. He's got webbed feet. He's got tremendous claws, if you notice. And look at his mouth. Does he have teeth? No teeth. But I guarantee you he'll be able to tear some flesh. Now, Snappy's about 25 years old. he's a regular snapping turtle, can live to be 50 years old, weigh as much as 50 pounds. There's one other species of snapping turtle found in our region. It's called the alligator snapping turtle. Of course, they can live much longer and be much larger. I think somewhere around 200 pounds and maybe live 100 years old, be 100 years old. So Snappy the snapping turtle is a tertiary consumer. He is a carnivore, and wow, he's quite a fellow. Why do they call him a snapping turtle? Let's watch. Wow, did you see that? All right, now he doesn't want to let go, and I'm going to put him back in his bucket. Now, as far as the decomposer is concerned, the primary decomposer, and I wish I had time to spend with you today, we would get out the microscope and we would start searching for microbes. Bacteria is the primary decomposer in water, plus other microbes that exist there. So we call those microbes simply because we cannot see them with our eyes. We have to use that instrument called a microscope to observe. Hopefully you got an idea about how the energy flows from producers, consumers, and then when something dies, let's say that Snappy dies. First thing that's going to come in and start recycling his carcass or his body, we're going to get scavengers. And then what's left is, what's really going to help it break down and be recycled in that environment is the microbes that come in and finish the job. I'm going to finish up because I think I've run out of time. I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Broughton. So maybe if you have questions that you need to ask, you can ask him and he'll answer them for you. Thank you for your time, guys.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. One of the questions that came in was, what other decomposers live in a pond? And there are all types of worms that live in a pond that help decompose dead and decaying plant and animal matter. There are red wigglers, earthworms, and other worms that live in a pond. All right, now we are going to turn it over to Mrs. Fuller, who is going to discuss the interdependence of organisms.
Good morning, boys and girls. My name is Mrs. Fuller. I'm going to be talking to you about interdependence. This is, like Mr. Monroe pointed out, is the biota or the biotic side, the living side. I'm going to share my screen with you. We're going to look at a few things here. So, well, maybe we will and maybe we won't. Okay, I think we'll probably just go back to this screen right here. And let's stop sharing. Okay. Well, when we talk about interdependence, we're talking about organisms that depend on other organisms in order to carry out life processes. For example, the number one independent or interdependent relationship between animals is that of food. So you've all seen the cartoon where a tiny fish is being eaten by a small fish, being eaten by a medium-sized fish, being eaten by a large fish, and all of which at the end is a great big fish. Well, we call that the food chain, but it's much more complex than that. And in a food chain, when you look at the diagram of a food chain, you see a lot of arrows. The end of the arrow, the pointy part of the arrow, points to the direction that the energy flows. So in the little food chain example I just gave you, the arrow would go from the tiny fish to the small fish, to the medium, to the large, and then to the big one. So we've got a lot of food-related interdependence, but we also have things like shelter. We have organisms that are dependent upon each other for shelter. Now, using a non-aquatic example, prairie dogs dig very extensive burrows, and other animals depend on the prairie dogs' burrows in order to be able to find shelter. For example, the burrowing owl very often will shelter in the burrow system of a prairie dog, and also rattlesnakes. So just because one animal makes something doesn't mean it's used solely by that one animal. Successful pollination, we all know examples where certain flowers are structured so to receive only the beak of a hummingbird or only the face of a bat, so that that particular animal can pollinate other plants of that type, and also seed dispersal. Many plants are very dependent on other organisms in order to disperse their seeds. So one big concept in ecology is called symbiosis. And in symbiosis, two organisms of different species exist where one lives near, on, or inside another. And we've got three different kinds of symbiosis. Now in symbiosis, sometimes one benefits, sometimes both benefits, sometimes one is harmed. So the first type we're going to talk about is mutualism. And in mutualism, both species benefit. So we would think of lichen as being an example of that. A lichen, it looks like one thing, but it's an algae embedded in a fungi, and they both benefit. The algae provides the food making mechanism, the chlorophyll, and the fungi provides the structure. So that would be an example of mutualism. Then we have commensalism, where think of a whale. A whale, very often when you see the pictures of the whale, they will have barnacles stuck to their fin, their flippers, or their skin. Those barnacles are just taking a ride on the whale in order to be exposed to food, because they're filter feeders. Well, the whale's not helped by the barnacle, but it's not hurt by it either. So that's an example of commensalism, barnacles on a whale. And then we've got a last kind, and it's called parasitism. And in parasitism, one organism is benefited, the parasite is benefited, and the host is actually harmed. Now, there are several different kinds of parasites in water. You think about a fish louse, they'll attach themselves to the tongue or to the gills of a fish and sap the fish of nutrients, and it's really pretty unpleasant for the fish. So that's parasitism. So symbiosis is a broad spectrum of interrelationships between species, where one is helped and one is either helped, not helped, or hurt. So there's symbiosis. Then we've got other things that organisms in their interdependence, such as competition. Now, generally, animals are in competition, or plants are in competition with individuals of their own species. So they're in competition for mates. No other organism in a different species is going to be in competition for them for mates, but also for food and for territory. And a lot of animals are extremely territorial and have very large territories. When you think of plants, what are plants in competition? Well, they're in competition for light. If you look at sometimes at the ponds, they'll be completely covered with duckweed or giant salvinia. All different kinds of plants can actually cover completely and block the light. They benefit because they have the light, but other plants that would need the light can't get it because they're in competition with the plant that has covered the pond. Also water. Well, what do they need water for? Well, plants need water to carry out photosynthesis. As you know, that's one of the main components of photosynthesis, but they also need it as a solvent in their bodies for chemical reactions. And they're also in competition for minerals. So, so we've got several big concepts in interdependence. Number one being food, but the others all play their part as well. And one, I want to leave you with the concept that small changes can lead or can yield large consequences. So this has a bearing when we come to things like introduced species or exotic species, invasive species, how that they can actually harm an aquatic ecosystem like a pond or a lake. So if you have any other questions about interdependence, Mr. Broughton will be more than happy to help you with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fuller. One question that came up was, give an example of interdependence that takes place in our ponds. And one pretty amazing example is that our ponds actually dry up a lot, and then the fish in those ponds will die, but that attracts sometimes dozens to even hundreds of vultures will come and eat those fish. It's very rare to see hundreds, but we get quite a few vultures when those ponds dry up because they're eating all the fish that are drying up in those ponds. So that's kind of an interesting example of interdependence that happens here at our center. All right, now we're going to look at how energy flows and matter cycles with Mr. Ramirez.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be looking and studying how energy flows and matter cycles. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys so we can look at a super quick PowerPoint presentation. So let me just get that screen share started, and then we will present. Okay, so we are going to be identifying energy, how energy flows and matter cycles in aquatic systems. And that picture that you guys see right there is a picture of our very own pond that we have behind our building. So something cool is just before we left for winter break, there was no water there. I used to be able to walk all the way around and right through there. And then when we came back, I guess we had so much precipitation and rainfall that it actually filled all the way up again. So it's interesting to see how our ponds change over the months. So as we said before, living things need non-living matter as well as energy. And that non-living matter that living things need, we call those nutrients. So later on, we're going to be learning about carbon and nitrogen. And unlike energy, matter is recycled in ecosystems. And we're going to take a look at some of those matter cycles. Now, energy does not cycle within an ecosystem. Instead, it flows. And what that means is energy is entering a system when it is captured by primary producers, and it exits the system as it is used by a variety of different organisms. So that energy is being transformed through this process, and it's eventually escaping as heat and chemical energy. So let's take a look. I know Mr. Monroe showed us some very cool aquatic organisms with our producers, consumers, and decomposers. So using that information from Mr. Monroe, we can compile those organisms and create food webs and ecological pyramids. So here we have a food web, and y'all probably already know this, but food webs are just a combination of a variety of different food chains. So food chains make up food webs. And it's just showing the feeding relationships among different organisms. And then over here on the right, we have our ecological pyramid. And when we look at our pyramid, we see that we have our primary producers on the bottom, and they're getting their energy from the sun so that they are undergoing photosynthesis. And then our other levels, we have our consumers. We also call them heterotrophs. And as we move our way up through our ecological pyramid, we notice that it's getting smaller to the top, and that is representing the amount of energy that's being transferred. So as we move through each level, about only 10% of energy is transferred to the next higher trophic level. So the energy transfer is not very efficient at all. And then we talked about decomposers with Mr. Monroe. We can see that decomposers can be found at pretty much every level. So whenever an organism dies, a decomposer can come in and help to break it down. And then we always have that energy is being converted into heat energy. And so that's why we're losing a lot of that energy as we're going through each of those trophic levels. And then in our next slide, so that was energy flowing. Now we're going to talk about our biogeochemical cycles. And again, we said cycles we're mostly talking about the nutrients within an ecosystem. So one of the most common ones that you guys already know of is the water cycle or the hydrologic cycle. I'm not going to go too much into this. You can watch one of our previous videos to review it since we've already done it in a previous video. But this is a cycle that everyone is most familiar with, and it's everyone knows it because the main component of our body is made out of water. So about 60% of our own body is made out of water, and over 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. So as I'm describing some of the parts of the water cycle, be thinking about what do you guys notice in this diagram and see if you can explain any of the parts. So just really quickly, we all know that evaporation, so we see that word several times in this diagram. Evaporation is just that conversion of liquid water to water vapor in the atmosphere. And approximately 84% of evaporation is coming from our oceans, which makes sense considering about 3/4 of our Earth's surface is actually ocean, it's water. And then we have condensation. So condensation is simply the conversion of water vapor into tiny water droplets. And it's caused by that change in temperature, and it affects the amount of moisture that can be held by an air mass. So that's condensation. And then of course, condensation leads up to precipitation. And here recently, we've had quite a bit of precipitation in the form of rain. And then you can see how all of this kind of cycles all over again. Our next cycle that we're going to talk about briefly is the carbon cycle. So carbon is essential to life. It's essentially the building block of all molecules of life. And it's the key component to what people call nature's thermostat. So as I'm kind of describing this diagram, be thinking about what are some things that you see or notice in this diagram and see if you can explain some of the parts or things that you're seeing. So the reason that we consider carbon to be kind of nature's thermostat is because if there's too much carbon removed from the atmosphere, it will actually cool Earth. However, if there's too much added to the atmosphere, it will actually warm the Earth. So it's kind of like a delicate balancing act. And then it's also tied into our oceans. So carbon is dissolved in oceans too. Carbon can enter and leave our environment through the lithosphere. So hopefully you guys remember that lithosphere just means the rocks or volcanic activity. Carbon can also enter and leave through the biosphere, so photosynthesis, respiration, and when animals die, we are releasing carbon as well. The hydrosphere, so oceans, we said earlier that oceans help to dissolve some of that carbon. And then also, of course, our atmosphere has carbon in it from respiration, but also from the combustion of wood and fossil fuels. So that's some ways that we can get carbon added and removed from our environment. Now, it's important to note that in the past few hundred years, humans have extracted and burned fossil fuels that took millions of years to form. And this resulted in a removal of carbon from the major reservoir far faster than it can be added. So we are taking away carbon, but we're also adding it to the atmosphere much faster than it can be removed. Now, this is important for my next slide. And this is where it ties into our ocean and aquatic systems, is because that excess carbon can lead to ocean acidification. So something really cool that I learned. So the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they did some studies. So we know that in the past 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased due to human action. And this has caused the pH level of the oceans to fall. So it's becoming more acidic. And they're saying that it's probably around 30% increase in acidity over the past 200 years. So what this does is that increase in carbon dioxide, it's actually affecting oysters and corals. And y'all probably, if y'all watched one of our earlier lessons, Ms. Nash kind of went over this a little bit with the effects on seashells and corals. So here on this picture, we see the effect of acidification on our corals. It's dissolving the shells and exoskeletons of these organisms. So you can see a before picture, we have a healthy ocean, and then afterwards we have the high CO2 content and also high acidity levels here. So you can see the devastating effects. And then I came across this very cool study from the National Center of Biotechnology. And they actually studied similar effects in lakes. So here we have, if y'all saw one of our earlier videos, this is one of my favorite microorganisms. This is Daphnia, and it's also called the water flea. So in this study by the National Center for Biotechnology, they studied the effect of increasing CO2 and acidification in lakes. And what they found was, and this was a study that took place in Germany, so they found that in waters with high CO2, that the Daphnia, these cute little organisms here, their ability to sense predators was dulled. And it seemed like they were kind of sleepy and at times even unaware that predators were nearby. So it was kind of like, if you look up the video, and I don't have time to show it for you, but there's a link below. But if you look this up by yourself, it kind of looks like they were just totally unaware and didn't care if they got eaten. So it was really weird. So usually phantom midges eat Daphnia. And when the midge eats the Daphnia, it actually releases a chemical while it's eating. And typically Daphnia can pick up on that chemical, and they will either respond by, one, they will either swim away. Two, they will either raise these really cool neck spikes. So they actually have these spikes behind their neck that they can raise up to kind of scare away predators or deter predators from trying to eat them, since you wouldn't want to eat something that had spikes. Or some of them will even grow these weird helmet things on the top of their heads. And those weird helmet things are kind of another deterrent so that predators won't eat them. And it also protects them. It makes them harder to swallow. So scientists studied that in areas where there were these high CO2 contents, that they were not responding. They weren't doing any of those things to stay away or help themselves escape predators. And so they came to the conclusion that they are suggesting that CO2, that gas, must be acting as a narcotic. And it's essentially, it's making them senseless, and they're not able to respond appropriately to the threat of danger. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And since those are my favorite microorganisms, that kind of just caught my attention. So we can see that carbon levels do have a great effect on not only our seashells and our corals, but even things that we have here in our own lakes. We actually have Daphnia that we have studied in our own ponds that we have out here. So that kind of something more relatable to us here. And another cycle really quickly, we have the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen, we all know, is about 78% of the Earth's atmosphere. And it actually can't be used or absorbed directly by multicellular organisms. It must be fixed or combined with hydrogen or oxygen to provide compounds that these multicellular organisms can then use. So the way that we affect the nitrogen cycle is we can add nitrous oxide through anaerobic bacteria on livestock and waste. So here in this diagram, we see the organic matter from our cattle. Also, commercial inorganic fertilizers also increase the amount of nitrogen in a system. So farming, so out here at the Environmental Center, we have livestock. We also have a lot of farmland around us that use fertilizer as well. But on the other end, we can also remove nitrogen from our cycle when we harvest nitrogen-rich crops, also through irrigation of crops and leaching that also removes nitrogen. And when people burn or clear forest and grassland, they're also removing nitrogen from the soil. And then on the other end, that kind of relates more to us, and I'll show you a picture in just a second. We can actually add a lot of nitrogen into aquatic systems via agricultural runoff. So remember those fertilizers from our farmlands, but also municipal waste runoff also increases nitrogen in our ponds and lakes. So here at the Environmental Center, we've actually experienced eutrophication of our ponds. And eutrophication is just the excessive richness of nutrients in a lake or body of water. And it's due mostly from the runoff of fertilizers, especially around here from farmland. And it increases the plant growth because they thrive on that nitrogen. But the downside is, with all that increase of algae, it's actually decreasing oxygen. So we end up having these huge algae blooms. So in this picture right here, you see one of those algae blooms that we experienced a few months ago in one of our ponds. And this pond was so thick with that algae that pretty much all the fish that were in there died because there wasn't enough oxygen. So it's interesting really to see how our ponds change over time. So my challenge question for you guys, There's lots of other biogeochemical cycles that I didn't have time to go over. So I would like to see if you can research another example of a cycle, see if you can draw and label that cycle and explain its importance. And then my reflection question for you guys is, how does the water cycle, carbon, and nitrogen cycle relate to you? And then how do you impact these cycles, and why are they important to humans too? So I know when we talk about these cycles, we always talk about the plants and other animals, but as humans, we also impact these cycles and we're also affected by them as well. So think about that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to go ahead and pass it back to Mr. Broughton, and he's going to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ramirez. The question that came in was, where can I find the other videos that you guys have done? And I'm going to share my screen here real quick to show the link. If you're watching this on demand, you're going to have to pause this and write all that down. Or I think you can also, if you just go to youtube.com and search Mark Broughton, which is me, you should be able to find all the rest of our videos for aquatic science and all the other subjects that we've done and are doing for this school year. So now I'll stop sharing my screen there. Hopefully you get a chance to write that down, or you can watch the on demand when it becomes available and pause it. And I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Nash, who's going to discuss aquatic population cycles.
Hello, welcome to my classroom. And today we're talking about population, the population of different kinds of organisms in the aquatic ecosystem and the things that affect those populations. So obviously things like climate, we're all aware of the El Nino and La Nina cycles that affect fish populations. Another thing is, of course, the amount of rainfall. Here, we just saw with Ms. Ramirez the pictures of our own lakes that dry up and then they fill back up again. So that kind of climate or weather cycles really have a big effect on especially aquatic ecosystems, which depend, of course, on water. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to be focusing on some things I thought were really interesting. And these have to do with what we call the keystone species. So we know that everything is connected. And there's some really interesting ones that I had not known about. One particular one, mostly we think about the keystones being the top predator. So the shark likes to eat sea turtles. If there are no sharks, the sea turtles end up eating all the seagrass, and then other animals are affected by that loss of plant food. So if there are sharks around, the sea turtles don't stop. Okay? They keep moving, and so the seagrass is not eaten down to nothing. Another really interesting one in the aquatic ecosystem is an experiment that they did with starfish, sea stars, and they removed them all from one little section of coastline, and they discovered that after that, the mussel population exploded because these guys were the only ones that eat those mussels, I guess except for us maybe, but they were controlling the numbers of mussels. Once they removed the starfish, then there were 10 million zillion mussels and nothing else had a place to live. So really interesting connections between different animals and the populations of all the other animals. So let's look at a few little pictures here. And I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So plant and animal populations is a very complicated web that we've talked about with Mr. Monroe and also with Mrs. Fuller. So everything is connected to everything else. And also, of course, other biotic and abiotic factors affect the different organisms in that environment. So of course, the basis of food chain is plants and micro and macro invertebrates on the basis. So populations of these can fluctuate depending on water temperature, either through seasons or through other factors like climate change, water levels. It can be affected by removal of water for irrigation or for other human consumption, and quality, of course, pollution. Okay, so those things also will affect the populations of those bottom of the food chain. then there's some really interesting behaviors. And we used to have a lot of beaver out here, but because our ponds now dry up periodically, the beavers have moved on because they need permanent water. And they're even ready to make sure that they've got enough water by cutting down trees and building dams and these lodges. Now here in Texas, they don't do that very much because it doesn't get cold enough to freeze the water. They build those lodges and dams so they'll have a place to be under the water when the top of the water freezes. They have food stored and a place to get in and out of the lodge. But when they build those dams, they create wetlands and they create deeper water. So some kinds of animals will like that. But other kinds of animals use it like running water for maybe spawning or little invertebrates that need fast moving water, then those populations will be negatively affected. So it's good for the beaver and good for some, but not for everyone. Another really interesting one in terms of a top predator is the alligator. And we do have alligators around here. I've never seen one in the wild, but supposedly we've got them. And they're our top predator. That big snapping turtle that Mr. Monroe showed you is the biggest one we've got here now. But alligators would be able to eat even that guy. So the role of that top predator is to consume the other predators, like the snapping turtle, like a bass. So by doing that, the bass or the snapping turtle will not have as large an effect on those other smaller fish. Another way they affect the whole ecosystem is by digging holes in the river, and then those deep holes will survive drought conditions, and that way many other animals are able to survive when we have a drought. So another really interesting animal. So here's a little this just showed you what happens when we get too much fertilizer runoff. And here's some. They use a little experiment here and they put fertilizer in the left-hand side until we get that big algae bloom. And then the other side, they didn't, and the water is nice and clear. So that clarity affects the ability of aquatic plants and of course also the amount of oxygen in the water. So this is what people do to affect population. Another thing is our disasters that we cause. This is the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see here, years later, the effects are still there. So this is on the shoreline. You can walk along and see that effect, but also sampling of the organisms in the water, fish, birds, mammals, invertebrates. All those animals are affected by the pollution, and they're still being affected. These toxins don't really go away. They pretend they've cleaned it up. Well, they've cleaned up some of it, but not all of it. These things remain there and they just move through the ecosystem, and they move especially up the up the food chain. And if you're at the top of the food chain, you may end up with a lot of that. And these are very long-lasting toxins. And so we really need to think about what we're doing to our planet. Now, climate change is also causing big fluctuations in temperature and rainfall. So these can also really affect population cycles, and droughts and floods are bad, both bad. So we know our drought is bad. That looks a lot like our lake looks like that just recently. But too much water can also cause a lot of problems. Floods bring high levels of pollution and sediment into lakes and rivers. They wash away the shoreline plants and they destroy spawning areas. So all these events can also really adversely affect the natural system. And then Mrs. Fuller mentioned invaders. So here's our giant salvinia covering the surface of that little pond. And then our famous, the Asian carp that eat everything out and then jump around and destroy everything. It's ridiculous fish. So water is life for our planet, and we call it planet Earth, but maybe we should be calling it planet ocean. There's so much to learn and enjoy in and around the water in our world. So I'm challenging everyone to take a walk around any local park with a lake. Most of our parks around have a lake, or you can climb down to a creek bed. And once we can travel around again, you can take a trip to the Texas Hill Country and explore those amazing springs. Okay, San Marcos, Austin, all the way. Beautiful, amazing water coming up, clean, cold water, beautiful little rivers there, very different than what we have up here in this part of Texas. Then you can keep going all the way to the coast and all the way down to Padre Island National Seashore and explore different aquatic ecosystems and think about the things that are affecting the animals in those ecosystems. You can keep a journal, take pictures, and then think about what we can do to protect these ecosystems. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing now. There. I'm gonna stop sharing, and if you have any questions, you can ask Mr. Broughton. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nash. I'm going to share my screen one last time here to do a quick recap of what we did today. So today's field trip was all about interdependence and interactions in aquatic environments. During this virtual field trip, students identified the interdependence of organisms in the aquatic environment and the biosphere. Students identified how energy flows and matter cycles through the aquatic environment. Students also explored the factors affecting aquatic population cycles. So we started this virtual field trip off by exploring producers, consumers, and decomposers with Mr. Monroe. Next, we explored the interdependence of organisms with Mrs. Fuller. Third, we explored how energy flows and matter cycles with Mr. Ramirez. And we just saw aquatic population cycles with Ms. Nash. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate you taking the time to learn about aquatic science with us. We'd like to know what you think about this field trip, and you can let us know what you think by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback and filling out a short feedback form for this field trip. We hope to see you again in the next field trip for aquatic science. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.